The alpha stood tall at the edge of the training ground, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the dirt. Around him, the young cubs of his tribe sat, their bright eyes filled with fire, their bodies restless with energy they refused to direct. The alpha had spent many seasons training cubs before, shaping them into fierce hunters and protectors of their people. Never once had he failed to bring order. His voice was like thunder, his presence unshakable. But now, for the first time, his strength met a wall of silence and stubbornness. The cubs were different. They were not small anymore, yet they still carried the pride and playfulness of youth. When the alpha commanded them to stand in formation, some turned their heads away. When he ordered them to run, they stayed seated. Even when he raised his voice in a roar that shook the ground, they only stared back with defiant eyes. It was not fear that moved in their hearts, but resistance. The alpha felt something inside him burn. Never had his authority been questioned so openly. Day after day, he returned to the training ground. He tried every method he knew. He displayed his strength, slamming his claws into the earth, sending dust flying into the air. He showed them how quickly he could strike, how easily he could pin down any one of them. The younger cubs flinched, but still none obeyed. He offered rewards, fresh meat, honor, the promise of recognition. Still, they ignored him. He grew harsher, his patience thinning with every sunrise, but the cubs stood united in their refusal. The rest of the tribe watched from a distance. Whispers began to spread. Some said the cubs were simply spoiled, too used to safety and not enough hardship. Others murmured that the alpha was losing his touch, that age had softened him, that perhaps his reign was beginning to fade. The alpha heard the whispers, though none dared say it to his face. Pride kept him standing tall, but in the quiet of night, he felt the heavy weight of doubt pressing against his chest. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, the alpha sat alone at the edge of the campfire. His muscles ached from demonstrations of strength that had won him no respect. His throat felt raw from roars that had accomplished nothing. He looked across the camp and saw the cubs laughing together, chasing each other in games, their spirits untouched by his efforts. He could not understand them. In his youth, he had feared his elders. He had obeyed quickly, knowing that disobedience meant punishment. But these cubs seemed to live in a different world. Their resistance was not born from fearlessness alone. It was something else, something deeper. Among the tribe, there was one figure who never joined the whispers or the games: the human. He was an outsider, small in stature compared to the towering predators, his skin soft, his body fragile in their eyes. He had no claws, no sharp teeth, no powerful roar. To many in the tribe, he was little more than a curiosity. Yet, he had been allowed to stay after proving his worth in a moment long past, a time when his quick thinking had saved lives. Since then, he had been a quiet observer, living among them without ever stepping into their ways. The alpha often caught the cubs looking toward the human when they thought no one noticed. The human did not speak to them, not directly. He sat quietly during training, sometimes with a faint smile, sometimes with an expression of thought. His presence was soft, not commanding, and yet the cubs seemed to find something in him that they did not see in their own leader. The alpha did not understand this, and it troubled him. As the night stretched on, the alpha began to question himself. He was strong, but perhaps strength was no longer enough. He was loud, but maybe his roar no longer reached the ears of the young. For the first time, he wondered if leadership was more than power and fear. These were thoughts he did not dare share with anyone, not even his closest kin. To admit such weakness would be to admit failure. The struggle grew worse with each passing day. The cubs tested his patience in new ways, ignoring his drills, mocking his commands with playful mimicry when his back was turned. The alpha punished them with extra tasks, long runs, and heavy loads, but even punishment seemed powerless. The cubs endured, and when they gathered together afterward, they laughed louder than ever, as if defying him gave them joy. The tribe's elders grew uneasy. They feared that if the cubs could not be disciplined, the future of their people would be at risk. Without proper training, the next generation would be weak, unprepared to defend their home from threats. They approached the Alpha one evening, urging him to regain control quickly. Their words stung like daggers. To fail the cubs was to fail the tribe, and failure was not something the Alpha had ever allowed in his life. But as much as he tried, nothing changed. The cubs continued to resist, and the Alpha's frustration grew into anger. He roared louder, struck harder, pushed further, but the results were always the same. His commands carried no weight. His shadow no longer inspired fear. One morning, as the sun rose, the Alpha stood once more before the cubs. His body ached, his spirit heavy, but he refused to surrender. He raised his voice, giving the command to begin training. The cubs remained. Still, their eyes locked on him, but their bodies refusing to move. For a long moment, silence filled the air. The Alpha felt rage surge inside him, but beneath the rage was something worse. Helplessness. From the corner of his vision, he saw the human standing there as always, quiet, observant, his expression unreadable. The cubs glanced at him too, as if waiting for something. The Alpha clenched his fists, his pride torn between anger and confusion. Why did they look at the human? Why did they ignore the one who had led their people for years, who had fought battles, who had shed blood for their safety? The Alpha's struggle was no longer just with the cubs. It was with himself. His voice, once unshakable, no longer commanded obedience. His strength, once unmatched, no longer inspired respect. And as the cubs sat before him in silence, the Alpha began to realize that his greatest battle was not against their stubbornness, but against the limits of his own way of leading. The training ground became a place of tension, not growth. The Alpha's authority was fading, and though he fought to keep it, he could feel it slipping through his hands like water. Something had to change. Something had to give. And deep inside, though he would not admit it yet, the Alpha knew the answer. Might not come from his roar, but from the quiet presence standing at the edge of the field. The human had always been there, though many in the tribe treated him like he was invisible. He was smaller than all of them, weaker in every way when compared to the towering bodies of the predators. His hands held no claws, his teeth no fangs. And his voice never tried to echo like thunder the way the Alpha's did. Yet somehow, his quiet presence had begun to carry weight, even though he had never sought it. When the Alpha struggled to control the cubs, the human did not interfere. He never raised a hand, never offered a word of advice, and never pretended to know more than the one who led the tribe. Instead, he sat at the edges of the training grounds, sometimes with his legs folded, sometimes leaning against a rock, watching with calm eyes. His stillness was strange to the cubs. It was not the stillness of pride or authority, but of patience. The cubs, in their playful rebellion, often found themselves glancing at him. They did not know why. Perhaps it was because he never tried to force them, never shouted, never demanded obedience. He was simply there, steady and unshaken, as though the endless roaring of the Alpha had no power over him. To the cubs, it was a mystery. To the Alpha, it was an irritation he kept buried inside. The human's silence was not emptiness. It was a kind of quiet that made others feel the need to fill it. When the Alpha commanded, the cubs resisted with laughter or stubborn stillness. But when the human watched without speaking, they grew uneasy. Some cubs shuffled their feet, others lowered their eyes. His silence spoke louder than roars, though no one could explain why. One evening, after the cubs had once again refused to follow, the Alpha stood by the fire with his shoulders heavy. His strength had carried him through countless battles, but this was a war he could not win. He glanced across the camp and saw the human sitting alone as usual, poking at the fire with a stick, his face thoughtful but calm. For a moment, the Alpha wondered what the human saw when he watched. Did he see weakness in the leader? Did he see foolishness in the cubs? Or did he see something deeper that no one else could? The tribe whispered about the human too, though, never in his hearing. Some thought he was useless, a burden carried for the sake of old debts. Others thought he was clever, perhaps even wise, though they could not say why. But the cubs seemed drawn to him in ways they could not explain, and that was what unsettled the Alpha most. He was supposed to be the voice of command, the heart of authority. And yet, when the cubs looked at the human, they seemed to find something they could not find in their own leader. Days passed, and still the human did not step forward. He never challenged the Alpha's role, never attempted to speak over him. He simply observed. When the cubs disobeyed, he neither encouraged nor discouraged them. He let the moments unfold as though they were stories he was content to watch. It was this patience that began to set him apart. The cubs, tired of endless roars and punishments, found themselves wondering what the human would say if he ever spoke. They imagined it would be something gentle, not harsh. They imagined it would be something they wanted to hear, even if they did not yet know what it was. Slowly, their attention drifted more and more toward him, until it felt as though two figures now stood at the training ground, one commanding with force and one commanding with silence. The Alpha noticed. At first he ignored it, clinging to his pride. But the weight grew heavier each day. His authority was slipping, and though he wanted to blame the cubs, part of him began to blame the human too. He did not hate him, not truly. The human had done nothing wrong. But the Alpha could not understand how silence could succeed where power had failed. One night, while the stars stretched wide across the sky, the Alpha approached the human at the edge of camp. The air was cold, the fire between them glowing, faintly. The Alpha sat down heavily, his claws digging into the dirt, and for a long time neither spoke. The silence stretched, and the Alpha, for the first time, felt the strange weight of it. Finally, he broke it. "Why do they look at you?" His voice was low, almost a growl, but there was no anger, only confusion. The human lifted his gaze from the fire, meeting the Alpha's eyes. For a moment, he said nothing, as though he was carefully choosing his words. Then he answered softly, "Because I do not ask them to fear me." The Alpha frowned. "They must learn respect. Without it, they will be nothing. They will be weak." "Respect," the human said gently, "does not always come from fear. Sometimes it comes from being heard." The Alpha stared at him, the words settling like stones in his mind. He had never thought of it that way. His whole life had been built on the belief that strength was the only way to lead. The human, with no claws and no roar, spoke of another way, one the Alpha had never considered. The next day, nothing had changed, at least not on the surface. The Alpha gave his commands, and the cubs once again resisted. But in the background, the human's silence seemed to press against the air itself. The cubs glanced at him more often now, waiting, and though he still said nothing, his very presence seemed to pull at them. The Alpha began to watch as well. He noticed how the cubs leaned closer to one another when the human sat nearby, how they whispered less, how they grew quieter in his presence. It was as if his calmness settled into them, balancing their wild energy without a single word. The Alpha could not deny what he saw. The human's silence was shaping the cubs in ways his power never could. In the evenings, the Alpha thought deeply about the words he had heard. Respect does not always come from fear. Sometimes it comes from being heard. They echoed in his mind, pulling at his pride and forcing him to question everything he had believed. Was he wrong all along? Or had the world changed, leaving his ways behind? The cubs, meanwhile, began to grow restless in a new way. They were no longer satisfied with defying the alpha. They wanted something else now, something they could not name. They wanted the human to speak. They wanted to hear his voice, not in whispers or passing words, but in a way that mattered. And so, day by day, the tension grew. The alpha struggled with his pride. The cubs longed for something they did not fully understand, and the human remained silent, his patience unbroken. It was a silence that carried weight, a silence that spoke louder than any roar, a silence that was waiting for the right moment, when a single voice could change everything. The days had grown heavier in the camp. The alpha's commands had started to sound tired, even though he tried to keep his voice firm. The cubs no longer trembled at his roars. They listened, but they did not obey. It was as though something inside them had shifted, though no one could quite explain it. What had once been fear had turned into defiance, and what had once been respect had turned into curiosity. That curiosity always led them back to the human. The human, still silent, had become the center of the storm without asking for it. He had not raised his voice, had not challenged the alpha, and yet everything seemed to bend around him. The cubs watched him with wide eyes, waiting for something he had not yet given: his words. Even the alpha, though he would not admit it aloud, found himself listening for a voice that never came. Then came the day that changed everything. It began like any other. The sun rose, painting the sky with pale light, and the cubs gathered at the training ground. The alpha stood tall, his claws striking against the stone, his voice echoing across the field. "Stand! Fight! Show me your strength!" he roared. But the cubs only shuffled their feet. They looked at one another, restless and uneasy, and then their eyes drifted toward the human sitting at the edge. The alpha's temper burned hot. He pounded the ground, his growl shaking the air, but still the cubs refused to move. Their eyes were fixed on the man with no claws, no fangs, no roar. And then it happened. One of the youngest cubs, smaller than the rest, limped forward. It had been injured days before, a cut across its leg that had not yet healed. The alpha growled for it to return to the line, but the cub ignored him. Instead, it turned its gaze to the human and walked toward him slowly, dragging its weak leg. The camp fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Every pair of eyes turned to see what the human would do. For the first time, he was not just an observer. The cub had chosen him. The human's eyes softened. He set aside the stick he had been holding, rose to his feet, and knelt down to meet the cub. His hands, smaller than the great paws of the predators, moved gently as he touched the cub's leg. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. He simply looked at the wound, then at the cub, and gave a small nod as though to say, "I see you." That moment cracked the silence wide open. The cub leaned into him, lowering its head, and the human finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the training ground. "You are not weak," he said softly. "You are learning. Even wounds teach us." The words were simple, but they fell like thunder. The cub's ears twitched. The other young ones straightened, their eyes widening. And the alpha, he froze, his chest heavy with something he could not name. For the first time, the human's voice had risen in the camp, and it had done what all his roars had failed to do. It had reached the cubs' hearts. One by one, the cubs began to step forward. They moved not because the alpha commanded them, but because they wanted to be near the human. They wanted to hear more. They wanted to feel the same quiet strength that had made the wounded cub believe it was not weak. The alpha's claws dug into the earth. His pride screamed at him to roar, to drive the cubs back, to remind them of who led the tribe. But a part of him, the part that remembered the human's words by the fire, stopped him. Respect does not always come from fear. Sometimes it comes from being heard. The words repeated in his mind, louder now, and they stung. The cubs gathered. Around the human, their eyes shining with hope. He looked at them not as soldiers to be commanded, but as young lives still growing. He spoke again, and this time his voice carried warmth, not force. "You are strong," he said, "but strength is not only in claws or teeth. Strength is in patience. Strength is in helping one another stand when you fall. You will grow into what you are meant to be, but only if you learn together." The cubs' tails flicked with excitement. Their eyes sparkled. For the first time, they listened, not because they feared punishment, not because they wanted to impress, but because the human's words had awakened something inside them. The Alpha stood in silence, watching. He had always believed that leadership came from dominance. But here was this small, fragile being, one without power, one without roar, leading with nothing but gentleness. And the cubs were following. The Alpha felt anger, but beneath it, he also felt something heavier. Doubt. The turning point had come, and everyone knew it. The cubs no longer looked to the Alpha for direction. Their eyes had shifted. Their loyalty was beginning to take root in someone else. That night, the camp was restless. Whispers spread from fire to fire, from parent to elder. The story of the human's words to the cub spread quickly. Some said it was dangerous, that his voice was weakening the authority of the Alpha. Others said it was a sign of change, a gift that could not be ignored. For the first time, the tribe itself was divided. The Alpha sat alone, his mind torn. He wanted to be angry, to drive the human away, to silence the voice that had stolen the cubs' hearts. But he could not forget what he had seen in their eyes. For the first time, they had looked not stubborn, not playful, but truly alive. They had listened with a joy he had never been able to give them. And the Alpha, as much as it wounded his pride, could not deny that it was good for them. The human, meanwhile, returned to his quiet ways. He did not seek to rise as a leader. He did not boast of what he had done. He simply sat at the edge of the camp again, silent as before. But his silence had changed now. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of someone who had spoken and been heard. The cubs, however, would never forget. To them, the moment was more than words. It was the moment they realized they were seen, not as tools of war, but as living beings learning their path. The human's kindness had planted a seed that could not be uprooted. From that day on, everything was different. The Alpha felt the shift. The tribe felt the shift. The cubs felt the shift most of all. The balance of power had begun to change, and no one knew where it would lead. But one thing was certain. The turning point had come, and the human's voice had opened a door that could never again be closed. The camp had grown quieter after that day. The cubs, who once dragged their feet and ignored the Alpha's commands, now carried a different energy within them. They had heard the human's voice, soft but strong, and it had stayed in their hearts, like a flame that refused to go out. They whispered to one another at night, repeating the words he had spoken, and even when they trained, they remembered his calm presence. The Alpha could feel the change more than anyone. His roars did not echo the way they once had. His commands did not hold the same grip. The cubs obeyed, but not for him. They obeyed because the human had taught them why. The Alpha's pride was wounded, but he could not deny the results. His young ones were learning, faster and with more focus than before. Yet every step they took, every strike they practiced, was tied to the memory of the human's words, not his. The elders noticed, too. Around the fires, they murmured about the strange turn of events. Some called it dangerous. How could a human, a fragile being with no claws, no fangs, no roar, hold such influence over the next generation? Others said it was a gift, a blessing from the stars, that someone so different could see what they, themselves, had forgotten, that strength came not only from dominance, but from care. One evening, the Alpha sat near the fire, his shadow stretching long against the ground. His eyes burned as he watched the cubs gather around the human. They leaned close, listening as he spoke quietly, telling them stories not of battles, but of patience, of helping each other, of standing tall even when wounded. The Alpha wanted to interrupt, to remind them who their leader was, but his voice stayed trapped in his throat. For the first time in his life, he did not know if roaring would make things better or worse. Then came the moment that would test everything. The tribe was threatened, not by war, but by nature itself. A storm swept. Across the land, dark clouds heavy with rain and winds so strong that even the elders feared their homes would not hold. The cubs panicked. They cried out, their small bodies shaking as thunder cracked the sky. The Alpha tried to calm them with commands, but his voice was swallowed by the howling wind. Fear spread fast, and for the first time, the Alpha felt powerless. It was then that the human stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not roar. He simply walked to the cubs, his steps steady even as the storm lashed around him. He knelt down and raised his hands, guiding them to gather close together. His voice, though quiet, cut through the chaos like a light. "Stay close," he said. "You are stronger together. Do not fight the storm. Endure it." The cubs pressed against each other, their small hearts beating fast, but his words gave them courage. They held their ground, shivering but steady as the storm raged on. The Alpha watched, his chest heavy with something he could not name. His own roars had failed, but the human's voice, gentle, patient, had given the cubs the strength to face the storm. When the winds finally calmed and the rain slowed, the cubs looked at the human not with fear, not with doubt, but with pure respect. In their eyes, he had become more than an outsider. He had become a protector, a guide. The Alpha felt the weight of the moment. The respect he had once commanded by force had shifted. It now belonged to someone who had never asked for it, someone who had earned it not by dominance, but by kindness. That night, the elders gathered. Their voices rose in debate. Some argued that the human was dangerous, that he was stealing the hearts of the young and weakening the Alpha's place. Others, however, spoke of the storm, of how the cubs had found strength not in claws or fear, but in his words. They said it was proof that his presence was meant to change them, to remind them of lessons they had forgotten. The Alpha listened in silence. Every word cut into him. He had always believed that strength was shown by control, by how loud one could roar or how fiercely one could fight. Yet here was a human, fragile and small, earning more respect in a storm than he had in all his years of command. It was not respect demanded. It was respect given freely. The next day, the Alpha approached the human. The camp fell silent, every eye watching as the great leader stood before the quiet man. For a moment it seemed as though a fight would break out, as though the Alpha would finally unleash the anger boiling inside him. But instead, something unexpected happened. The Alpha lowered his head, not in defeat, but in recognition. "You have given them what I could not," he said, his voice deep and heavy. "They listen to you, not because they fear you, but because they believe you. That is a strength I never understood." The human said nothing at first. He looked at the Alpha, then at the cubs, who were watching with wide eyes. Finally, he spoke. "They need both of us," he said softly. "Your roar teaches them power. My voice teaches them patience. Together they will learn balance." The Alpha's eyes burned with pride and pain all at once. But deep inside, he knew the human. was right. For the first time, he understood that leadership was not about standing above others. It was about standing with them. From then on, the camp changed. The alpha still trained the cubs, his voice loud and firm, but the humans stood nearby, offering words when fear or doubt crept into their hearts. The two of them, so different in every way, began to work together. The cubs grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit. They no longer trembled at roars or storms because they had learned that true respect was not forced, it was earned, and in the quiet moments, when the stars stretched across the night sky, the cubs whispered to one another about the lessons they had learned. They spoke not only of claws and battles, but of kindness and unity. They had begun to see the world in a new way, a way that blended the strength of their alpha with the wisdom of the human. The alpha knew then that respect was not a gift to be demanded, but a bond to be earned, and the human, without ever seeking power, had given that truth back to the tribe. It was a lesson that would echo for generations. The seasons passed, and time left its mark on the land and the people who lived there. The cubs who had once trembled at the sound of storms and roared clumsily in the training grounds were no longer small. They had grown tall, their shoulders broad and their steps steady. Yet, even as they grew into strong warriors, they never forgot the human's voice that had first given them courage. His words were like threads woven into their hearts, guiding them through every challenge they faced. The alpha, too, had changed. He still roared with power, his presence still demanded attention, but there was something different in his eyes. The sharp edge of pride had softened into wisdom. He no longer saw the human as a rival, but as a teacher who had opened his eyes to something he himself had missed. Where once the alpha had thought leadership meant control, now he understood. It meant responsibility, not only to lead with strength but also with understanding. The human did not seek praise. He did not stand before the tribe as if he wanted glory. Instead, he continued as he always had, moving quietly among them, teaching through actions rather than demands. He showed the cubs how to care for one another, how to stand tall without crushing those who were weaker, and how to see hope even in moments of fear. For him, it was never about becoming important. It was about leaving something good behind. And he did. The cubs who had once been restless and rebellious grew into leaders themselves. They taught the younger ones not only the strength of their claws, but also the strength of patience, kindness, and unity. Around the fires, they told stories of the day the storm came and how the human's soft voice had calmed their hearts. They spoke of the moment the alpha had lowered his head not in defeat, but in respect. These stories became part of their traditions, passed down like treasures from one generation to the next. The elders, who once questioned the human's place among them, began to see the truth more clearly as the years passed. They watched as the tribe became stronger, not only in body, but in spirit. They saw fewer fights break out among the cubs, less fear in their eyes during trials, and more unity in their ranks. Slowly, the whispers of doubt turned into words of gratitude. They realized the human had not stolen the future of the tribe, he had shaped it. There were still some who struggled with the change. Some believed that no outsider should hold such influence, but even they could not deny what had happened before their eyes. The proof was in the cubs who grew up with balance in their hearts. The proof was in the alpha who no longer stood above his people but among them, and the proof was in the peace that settled over the tribe in times of hardship. One night, long after the storm had passed and many seasons had come and gone, the human sat quietly beneath the stars. The cubs, now young adults, gathered around him, asking for stories. He told them of his own world, of rivers that sparkled in the sunlight, of mountains that reached so high they seemed to touch the heavens, and of people who learned, just like them, that strength without kindness was hollow. His voice was steady, but there was a weight in his eyes. He knew his time among them would not last forever. Humans did not live as long as the alpha's kind. But he was not sad. He looked at the faces of those who had once trembled as small cubs, and he saw in them the legacy he would leave behind. His words had taken root. Even when he was gone, they would live on through them. The Alpha approached that night, his massive frame casting a long shadow, but his steps were gentle. He sat beside the human without a word. The two of them gazed up at the stars in silence, their bond deeper than words could explain. Finally, the Alpha spoke. "You came to us as an outsider," he said, his voice low. "I feared you. I doubted. You and I even resented you. But now I see. You have given my people something I never could alone. When you leave, your voice will not fade. It will remain in them, in me, in every roar that carries both strength and care." The human smiled, softly. "That's all I ever hoped for," he replied, and it was true. He did not wish for statues or songs sung in his honor. His greatest hope was simple, that kindness, the smallest act of it, could outlive him. Years later, when the human was no longer there, the tribe kept his memory alive in ways both big and small. The training grounds where the cubs once struggled were renamed in his honor. Each time a new generation of cubs began their training, they were told not only of the Alpha's roars, but of the human's quiet words that had carried them through the storm. It became tradition to begin each lesson not with a roar, but with a story, a reminder that respect is not forced, but earned. The Alpha grew old, his fur touched with silver, but his heart carried the weight of what he had learned. He spoke often, of the human to the young ones, his deep voice steady as he reminded them that true leadership required balance. He no longer saw respect as something owed to him by birth. Instead, he understood it as something to be built through trust, compassion, and fairness. The cubs listened with wide eyes, their imaginations painting pictures of the human who had once walked among them. They asked questions, and the elders told stories. They remembered the storm, the calm voice, the moment of unity that changed everything. And so the legacy of the human lived on, not through monuments of stone, but through living hearts. Each generation carried his lessons forward, teaching them alongside the strength of the Alpha. The two forces, roar and voice, power and kindness, were no longer separate. They were one. When the stars shone brightly above, the tribe often looked up and wondered if somewhere out there the humans' people told stories of him too. They imagined that his kindness had touched not only their world, but perhaps others across the stars. What began as one voice among cubs had become a lasting legacy, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could echo louder than the fiercest roar, and that true respect was never taken, but always earned. And in that truth, the human spirit lived on forever.